The flowers on her wedding table were already wilting. Lucy noticed it the moment she stepped into the great hall, the white larkspur drooping at their stems, petals curling inward like small fists refusing to open. She had chosen them herself, 3 weeks prior, from the packhouse gardens. The head gardener had promised they would hold through the ceremony. They had not. She stood at the threshold of the hall and looked at those dying flowers and felt, with a precision that frightened her, that they were trying to tell her something. She did not listen. That was the first mistake. The Ashevale Pack's great hall smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and the faint sweetness of mead being warmed somewhere behind the kitchen doors. Torches burned in their iron brackets along the stone walls, casting amber light across the long oak tables already set with linen and silver. Guests had not yet arrived. The ceremony was still 2 hours away. And in that quiet, Lucy moved through the hall alone, adjusting a centerpiece here, straightening a ribbon there, doing the small, useless things that women do when they are trying not to think. She was 23 years old, and she was about to marry the man her father had chosen for her, and she had spent the last 6 months convincing herself that this was enough. His name was Dorian Ashevale, eldest son of Alpha Crest Ashevale, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that portraits are handsome, perfect and slightly cold. He had never been cruel to her. He had never raised his voice. He had given her a room with a large window and sent her fresh bread every morning and smiled at her in the way that men smile at things they consider already secured. She had told herself that this was kindness. She had told herself that affection could grow like a plant in poor soil, slowly, without much light, if you were patient enough. She was very good at being patient. What she was not good at, had never been good at, was ignoring the particular quality of silence that gathered around her when she entered a room where people had just stopped speaking. It happened again now. She had crossed the hall toward the corridor that led to the kitchens, intending to check on the mead, when she heard voices behind the half-open door of Crest Ashevale's private study. She recognized them immediately. Dorian's low baritone, his father's rougher, older rasp, and a third voice she did not recognize at first, smooth, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering news that others would rather not hear. She should have kept walking. She stopped. The deed is already signed. Once the ceremony is complete and the bond is registered with the council, her claim transfers fully to the Ashevale name. The Morvain territory, the northern trade routes, everything her father left in her name. A pause, the creak of a chair. And if she contests it? Dorian's voice, calm, utterly calm. She won't, said the older man. She has no pack of her own, no wolf, no allies on the council. What is she going to do, Dorian? Stand up in front of the assembly and demand rights she has no power to enforce? She's an Omega without a Lobo. She's nothing without this union, and she knows it. Lucy's hand had found the doorframe. She did not remember reaching for it. Her fingers pressed into the cold stone, and she stood there, in the corridor that smelled of candle wax and pine. And she listened to the rest of it. The third voice again. There is also the matter of the Northern Patrol reports. The Alpha King's men have been crossing the boundary ridge more frequently this past month. If Leander moves to claim the Morvain territory before the marriage is finalized... He won't, said Crest Ashevale. Leander has never shown interest in the borderlands. Too small for his ambitions. No, our concern is completing this tonight, before Lucy has time to think too carefully about the inheritance clauses in the contract. Silence. Then Dorian, again, with that voice that had never once risen above a murmur in her presence. Does she know what she signed? She signed what she was given. She trusts you. A soft sound, something between a laugh and an exhale. Yes, Dorian said. She does. Lucy released the doorframe. She walked back through the great hall, past the wilting larkspur, past the silver cutlery and the linen that smelled of lavender and lye. She walked up the stone staircase to the chamber she had been given as her dressing room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she stared at the wedding dress hanging on the wooden stand across the room. It was a beautiful dress. Ivory silk, embroidered at the hem with small silver threads. She had thought, when she first saw it, that it looked like moonlight on water. Now it looked like a trap, with very elegant teeth. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and made herself breathe. Her father had been dead for 14 months. He had died of a fever in early autumn, a fever that came on too quickly and burned too hot and left too little behind. A cold room, a will written in his own hand, and a daughter standing in the middle of everything he had built with no pack to hold it and no wolf to defend it. The Morvain territory was hers by blood and by law, but blood and law meant very little when you were an Omega who could not shift, whose inner wolf had been silent since childhood, a stillness inside her where most shifters felt the living pulse of their animal half. The healers called it a suppression. Her father had called it a mystery. The pack had called her, quietly and without particular malice, the hollow girl. Dorian had called her a rare treasure. She had believed him. She looked at the wedding dress. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the torches in the corridor guttered and steadied. Somewhere below, she could hear the first carriages arriving, wheels on cobblestone, the creak of axles, voices calling out in greeting. The guests were beginning to come. She thought about the inheritance clauses in the contract she had signed. She thought about how Dorian had watched her sign it, seated across from her, unhurried, offering her wine with both hands, and how she had not read every page because she had trusted him. She thought about her father's handwriting in the will. She thought about 14 months of patience and small kindnesses and fresh bread every morning, and she understood, with a cold and clarifying completeness, that she had been managed. She stood up. She crossed the room and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Beneath her spare underdress and the wool stockings she had packed for the journey to Dorian's estate, there was a small leather satchel. Emergency things, her father had always said. Always keep emergency things close. Inside it, a folded letter of her father's seal, a small amount of coin, a hunting knife with a bone handle, and a cloak in dark gray wool. She took the satchel. She took the cloak. She did not take the wedding dress. The window of the dressing room looked out over the eastern garden, a narrow drop to a stone ledge, then a trellis thick with dormant climbing roses, thorns but no blooms in the cold season. She had noticed it 3 weeks ago with the idle curiosity of someone who had no reason to leave and had filed it away anyway. The way you file away exits in a room you do not yet know will become a cage. She pulled on the cloak, swung the satchel across her shoulder, and climbed through the window into the cold. The trellis held. The thorns caught at her hands and left thin red lines across her palms, but she barely felt them. Below, the garden was empty. The servants were all at the front of the house for the arriving guests, and the torchlight from the great hall windows painted bright squares across the dark frost-hardened ground. She dropped the last few feet and landed without sound and stood still for a moment, listening. No alarm. No footsteps. She moved into the shadows along the eastern wall and then into the tree line beyond the garden, the pine forest that ran along the back edge of the Ashvale grounds, and she walked fast, the cold air burning in her lungs, the smell of resin and frozen earth rising around her with every step. The moon was up, a fat, indifferent half-moon, and it gave enough light to see the path between the trees without stumbling. She did not know where she was going. She knew only what she was going from, and that for now would have to be enough. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the wolves. Not her. She had no wolf, no shift, no warning system built into her blood. What she heard was the physical sound. Paws on frozen ground, fast and deliberate, moving through the trees to her left. More than one. And then, from the ridge ahead, a sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite a command, but carried the weight of both. A single low note that made the trees seem to lean away from it, that moved through Lucy's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She stopped. Through the dark pine trunks, 2 wolves emerged onto the path ahead of her. Large, dark-coated. They did not bare their teeth. They simply stood there, blocking the path, and looked at her with eyes that caught the moonlight and held it. And then, between the trees to her right, a man stepped out of the shadow. He was tall enough that the low pine branches that would have caught another man's shoulders passed his chest instead. He wore leather and dark wool, a fur-lined cloak hanging from broad shoulders, the straps of a harness crossing his chest. His hair was pulled back, dark braids against a strong neck, and his eyes, even in the dim moonlight, were the particular blue of winter sky at midday, pale and absolute, and carrying in them a quality that Lucy had never encountered before in any person's gaze. The complete and unhurried certainty of someone who has never in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was standing in a dark forest in a gray cloak with thorns cuts on her hands and a bone-handled knife in a satchel, 3 hours before her own wedding, and she had absolutely no idea who this man was. He did not introduce himself immediately. He studied her face, her hands, the scratches, the cloak, the direction she had come from, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The way a man looks at something he was already searching for before he knew he was looking. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was low and even, the same quality as that sound from the ridge. Not loud, but it went everywhere. Lucy lifted her chin. "I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Ashvale estate is that way." He tilted his head toward the direction she had come from. "You came from it." "Also aware. The ceremony starts in less than 2 hours. I know when it starts." He looked at her for another moment. Behind him, the 2 wolves remained still, watching. "Are you running?" he said. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation. "Or are you going somewhere?" Lucy held his gaze. The cold was working its way through the wool of her cloak, and her hands were beginning to sting properly now, and she was acutely aware that she had no plan, no ally, no pack, and no wolf, and that she was standing alone in the dark in front of a man who radiated the kind of authority that made the air around him feel different. "I'm going somewhere," she said. She did not know if it was true, but it was the only thing she could say that felt like it still belonged to her. The man looked at her for one more long moment. Then he reached into the folds of his cloak and produced a strip of clean linen, the kind carried by soldiers, wrapped tight and practical, and held it out toward her. "Your hands," he said simply. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him, then at the wolves still waiting in the dark behind him. Everything in her experience of the past 6 months told her to be careful about accepting things from men who offered them too easily. But her hands were bleeding, and the night was very cold, and she was, for the first time in 14 months, entirely on her own. She reached out and took the linen. She wrapped the linen around her palms herself. She did not ask for help, and he did not offer it, which she noticed, and filed away, the way she had learned to file away everything that might later matter. He told her his name only after she had finished tying the last knot. "Leander," he said. Nothing else. No title, no pack designation, no explanation of why he and 2 enormous wolves were patrolling the pine forest behind the Ashvale estate at night. Just the name, offered the way a man offers a coin on a table. Take it or leave it. Lucy felt the name land somewhere in her chest and stay there. She had heard it, of course. Every pack in the Northern Territories had heard it. Leander Voss, Alpha King of the Iron Vale seat, lord of 7 allied packs and sovereign of more land than her father's entire territory multiplied 4 times over. The man the council whispered about. The man that other alphas straighten their spines for. She had heard his name in hushed conversations at her father's table, in letters her father received and answered with careful, measured words, in the mouth of Crest Ashvale himself, just an hour ago, spoken with the particular wariness that men reserve for those they know they cannot outmaneuver. She looked at him now, really looked, and felt the cold clarity of understanding settle over her like a second cloak. "You were already watching the estate," she said. It was not a question. He met her eyes. Yes. The inheritance clauses, the Morvain territory. A pause. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, she thought, but a recalibration. He had not expected her to arrive at it so quickly. "The boundary reports," he said carefully, suggested an irregular transfer of land rights was being prepared. "They were taking it from me," and she said it plainly. She had decided, somewhere between the trellis and the tree line, that she was done softening things for the comfort of others. My father's territory, everything he left me. The marriage contract gave it to the Ashvale name the moment the bond registered. I didn't read it carefully enough. She paused. I trusted the wrong person. Leander was quiet. He did not offer her sympathy, did not tilt his head or soften his voice or say, "I'm sorry," the way people say it when they mean nothing by it. He simply stood in the cold and listened, and when she was done, he said, "How much did you take with you?" She patted the satchel at her side. "Enough." "Where were you going?" "Away." He looked at her for a long moment. The two wolves had settled into a low watch, one sitting, one standing, their breath misting in the cold air. The pine forest was very quiet around them. The kind of quiet that exists only in winter, dense and particular, as though the trees themselves were listening. "There is a lodge," Leander said finally, 4 miles north along the ridge. "My second and 3 of my guard are stationed there. It's within Ironvale patrol boundaries. Ashvale men won't cross it." He paused. "You would be safe until morning." Lucy looked at him. Every careful instinct she had developed over the past 14 months told her to hesitate. She had trusted a man who offered her comfort and safety and fresh bread every morning. She had signed a contract without reading it. She had believed in patience and slow-growing things and the decency of people who had given her no real evidence of decency at all. She had been managed, carefully and completely, and she had not seen it until she heard it said aloud in another man's voice. And now, a stranger in a dark forest was offering her shelter. "Why?" she said. He did not look away. "Because you're bleeding in a pine forest at night with no wolf and no pack and a satchel that I suspect holds less than you're pretending. That's not a reason. That's a description." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, acknowledged and then put away. "The Morvain territory borders Ironvale land," he said. "What happens to it concerns me politically, and—" He stopped for a moment, and when he continued, his voice was the same as before, even and unhurried. But something in it had changed by a fraction that she could not name. "You came through that window rather than wait for the ceremony. That matters." She did not ask him what it meant. She was not ready to ask him what it meant. She looked at the dark path ahead, at the 2 wolves waiting, at the cold miles between here and anywhere that was not the Ashvale estate. Then she looked at her wrapped hands, at the clean linen he had produced without fanfare or performance, and she made the only decision that was honest. 4 miles, she said. "Less if we move directly." She nodded once. "Then let's move." The lodge sat on a natural shelf of rock above the ridgeline, sheltered on 3 sides by dense pines, and on the 4th by a stone face that had been there since before anyone's memory. It was not a grand structure. 2 rooms, heavy timber walls, a chimney already breathing smoke into the night sky, but it was solid, and it was warm. And when Lucy stepped through the door, she was met by the smell of burning pine and something savory simmering over the fire, and her body responded to both before her mind gave it permission. A man rose from the table as they entered, broad, dark-haired, with the alert stillness of a trained soldier. He looked at Leander, then at Lucy, then at her wrapped hands, and to his credit he asked no questions. Simply moved to the fire and ladled something into a clay bowl and set it on the table without being asked. "Soren," Leander said, and something passed between the two men in that single word. Acknowledgement, instruction, the compressed language of people who have worked together long enough to need very little. Soren nodded and left through the inner door. Lucy sat down at the table. She did not take off her cloak immediately. She wrapped her hands around the bowl. A thick broth, venison, and root vegetables, warmth radiating immediately into her stiff fingers. And she sat very still and let herself feel, for the first time since she had heard those voices through the study door, the full weight of what had happened. Her wedding night was supposed to be tonight. In the hall with the wilting larkspur and the warming mead, guests were arriving now, wondering where the bride had gone, and Dorian Ashvale was standing somewhere in that candlelit space, calculating what her absence cost him and how to recover it. She thought about the inheritance clauses. She thought about her father's will, written in his careful hand. She thought about 14 months of fresh bread and managed silences and a dress that looked like moonlight and was in fact a mechanism. She pressed her fingers harder around the bowl. "The contract," she said. Leander had taken the chair across from her, not crowding the table, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate. "If the ceremony didn't complete, if the bond was never registered, does the transfer still hold?" "No," he said. "The clause is contingent on consummation and council registration. Neither has occurred." She exhaled slowly. "Then it's still mine." "Legally, yes. Practically." He paused. "Crest Ashvale will challenge it. He'll claim breach of contract on your part. He'll argue the signing was binding regardless." "And the council?" "Divided. 3 seats favor Ashvale, 2 are neutral. 1, the faintest pause, is mine." She looked at him. "You have a council seat. I have 6. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a long, slow exhale. Lucy looked at this man across the table. This man who had appeared in a dark forest with clean linen and a measured voice and 6 council seats. And she felt the precise shape of the situation she was now in. She had escaped one arrangement, only to sit across from a man of considerably greater power, in his lodge, in his territory, dependent on his word. "What do you want?" she said. "In return." He looked at her steadily. "Nothing tonight. Tonight is not the question." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The Morvain territory is strategically important to Ironvale's eastern boundary. I won't pretend otherwise. Protecting your claim protects mine. That's the political reality. And the rest of it?" He met her eyes, and this time he did not offer the almost smile or the measured deflection. He simply looked at her, and there was something in that look, something still and certain and uncomfortably direct, that made the back of her neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Rest," he said. "There's a room through that door. Soren will be outside. No one will come in." It was not an answer to her question. She knew it was not an answer to her question. And yet it was, somehow, the right thing to say. Because what he was offering was not explanation, not persuasion, not a soft speech about trust. He was offering her a door with no one on the other side of it. After 6 months of being managed and arranged and prepared for someone else's use, a closed door felt like the most generous thing in the world. She stood. She picked up the bowl and drank the rest of the broth standing. because she was hungry and cold and done with performing delicacy for anyone. She set it back down. "If you try to use this against me," she said, "I will find a way to make it cost you. I have very little, but I am not without resources." Leander looked at her. "I know," he said, "and the simplicity of it. No amusement, no condescension, just acknowledgement, did something unexpected to the tightness in her chest." She went through the door. She did not sleep immediately. She lay on the narrow bed in the small pine-smelling room and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the wind. And she thought about her father's face, and about the wilting larkspur, and about the way Leander had said, "I know," as though her capacity for retaliation was not a threat he needed to manage, but simply a fact he had already accounted for. She thought about that for a long time. Eventually, the fire warmth seeped under the door, and the wind settled into a rhythm and exhaustion, the kind that comes not from physical exertion, but from the final collapse of sustained pretending, pulled her under, and she slept. Outside, in the main room, Leander sat alone at the table long after the fire had burned low, his hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. Soren appeared briefly in the doorway, looked at him, said nothing. Leander shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. Soren disappeared. The lodge was quiet. The wolves settled outside the door, and the alpha king of the Iron Veil seat sat in the dark with the particular stillness of a man who has just encountered something he did not expect, and is deciding, carefully, what to do about it. Morning came in gray and slow, the kind of dawn that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates. A gradual lightening of the dark between the pine trunks, frost on the window glass, the smell of wood smoke thickening as someone fed the fire before Lucy woke. She lay still for a moment after her eyes opened, orienting herself by smell before anything else. Pine, smoke, venison fat from the night before, cold stone and wool, and the particular dryness of a room that has been heated all night by a fire in the next room. Not the Ashvale estate, not the room with the window overlooking the eastern garden, not the dressing room with the ivory dress on its stand. The relief was so complete it felt physical, a loosening behind her sternum, like a knot releasing. She sat up. Her hands ached where the thorns had caught them, the linen wrapping stiff with dried blood at the edges. She unwound it carefully, examined the cuts, shallow, none of them serious, and rewound the linen tighter. Then she put on her cloak, ran her fingers through her hair, rebraided it without a mirror, and went through the door. Leander was already gone. Soren stood by the fire with 2 clay cups, and the air of a man who had been awake for several hours, and found this unremarkable. He was younger than she had thought the night before, perhaps 30, with a scar along his jaw and watchful dark eyes that assessed her with professional efficiency, and then looked away. "He rode out at first light," Soren said, handing her a cup. "Tea, bitter and strong. He'll return before midday." "Where did he go?" "To the Boundary." She drank the tea, and did not ask more. She sat at the table and thought, which was what she should have been doing for the past 6 months instead of arranging centerpieces and believing in slow-growing things. The facts, laid out plainly. She had fled her own wedding. The contract she had signed was contingent on a bond registration that had not occurred, which meant the Morvain territory was still legally hers. But Crest Ashvale would not accept that quietly. He would send men. He might already have sent men. He would frame her flight as breach and petition the council for the transfer regardless, and 3 of those council seats favored him, and she had no pack, no wolf, no alpha standing, and no allies except the man who had handed her a strip of linen in a dark forest, and whose motives she had not yet fully mapped. She set down the cup. "I need paper," she said, "and ink, if there is any." Soren looked at her for a moment, then went to a small chest along the far wall and produced both without comment. She appreciated that, the absence of questions, the simple compliance. She pulled the chest toward her, uncapped the ink, and began to write. The letter was to her father's oldest ally, a man named Aldrich Morvain, a distant relation, her father's second cousin, who had served as the territory's administrative elder for 30 years, and who, as far as she knew, had not been part of whatever arrangement the Ashvales had constructed. She wrote carefully and precisely what she had overheard, what she understood about the contract clauses, what she needed him to do, specifically, to present himself at the next council session and attest to the unbroken inheritance line. She sealed it with a drop of wax from the candle and pressed her signet ring into it, the Morvain seal, which she had worn on her right hand since her father's death, and which Dorian had never asked her to remove because he had never imagined she would use it for anything. She set the letter on the table and looked at it. Then she wrote a second letter. This one was harder. It was to her brother. Callum was 26, 2 years her elder, and he had been gone for 8 months. Taken, she had been told, by a rival pack in a border dispute that had since been resolved. The Ashvales had assured her he was being held peacefully, that negotiations for his return were ongoing, that the best thing she could do was remain calm and trust the process. She had believed this too, because she had been believing everything, and because the alternative, that her brother was being held as leverage, was something she had not let herself fully consider. She considered it now. If the Ashvales needed her compliant enough to sign a contract without reading it carefully, what better tool than a brother held at a comfortable distance, alive but inaccessible, a permanent reminder of what cooperation purchased and what resistance might cost. Her hand was very still on the page. She wrote, "Callum, if this reaches you, I am no longer at Ashvale. I am safe. Tell me where you are." She did not know if it would reach him. She did not know if he was still in the same place, or if he was in any condition to respond. But she sealed it and placed it beside the first letter, and when Soren returned, she asked him quietly but directly if there was a courier she could trust. He looked at the 2 letters, then at her. "I'll carry the first one myself," he said. "The second, I'll need to ask Leander. Then ask him when he returns." "Yes, my lady." She almost corrected him. She was not anyone's lady, had no formal title, had fled the only status that had been offered to her. But she stopped herself. The title was not wrong, exactly. It was just something she would need to earn back differently than she had imagined. Leander returned before midday, as Soren had said he would. He came in from the cold with frost on his shoulders, and the focused quiet of someone who has spent the morning gathering information and is now deciding how to present it. He removed his cloak. He sat down across from her without ceremony. He looked at the 2 sealed letters on the table, and then at her face. "The Ashvales have sent riders," he said. "3 teams, moving south and east. They're not heading this way, which means they don't know which direction you went, but they're covering ground fast. How long before they cover the northern routes?" "By evening, likely." She nodded. "Then I can't stay here." "No." He paused. "But you can't travel openly either. Not without an escort that carries enough weight to make their riders turn back." She looked at him. "You mean your escort?" "Yes. And if I travel under Iron Veil protection, the Ashvales will interpret that as a political move." "They will." "Will they be wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want to do next." She turned the signet ring on her finger. A habit, something her hands did when her mind was working. "I want to go to Morvain," she said. "My own territory. I want to stand in my father's hall and make it clear to every elder and landkeeper there that I am alive and unclaimed and that the contract was never completed. I want Aldrich Morvain to stand beside me when I do it, and then I want to bring my brother home." The fire snapped. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the pines in long waves. Leander looked at her with that unhurried, absolute attention. The look that she was beginning to understand was simply how he saw things, not performance, but genuine focus, and said, "Your brother, Callum Morvain. He's not in Ashvale custody." Something went very still inside her. "What?" "He hasn't been for 3 months." Leander's voice remained even, but there was something careful in it. The care of someone delivering information that will hurt. Delivered without cruelty, precisely because the hurt is unavoidable. He was transferred, sold, more accurately, to a holding run by a pack allied with the Drenvar coalition in the west. It's a debt arrangement. Crest Ashvale owed them and paid in collateral. The word collateral dropped into the room like a stone. Lucy said nothing. She breathed. She pressed the signet ring into her palm until she could feel the edge of it. Hard and specific and real. "You knew this," she said. Her voice was level. "I learned it 6 weeks ago, when my Eastern Patrol brought back the border reports. At that point, I had no standing to act without what? Without a reason? Without crossing into Ashvale's sovereignty and triggering a council dispute that would have taken months to resolve and accomplished nothing except warning them." He did not flinch from her anger. He sat with it, the way he sat with everything, steadily, without requiring it to be different. "I was building standing to act. That takes time. My brother has been in a Western holding for 3 months. Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the frost-gray morning and the dark pines. And she stood there for a long moment with her back to him, her hands flat against the sill, breathing. She wanted to be furious. She was furious. At Leander, at the Ashfields, at herself, at the 6 months she had spent in polite suspension, while the world quietly dismantled everything her father had built. But fury without direction was just noise, and she had no more patience for noise. She turned around. "Can you get him out?" "With the right approach, yes." "What does that require?" "Leverage over the Drenvar coalition, which requires your territorial claim to be officially reinstated and registered with the council, because the Morvain eastern boundary gives Ironvale pressure points over 2 of their allied packs." He paused. "Which means getting you to Morvain first." She looked at him. "So everything connects." "Everything connects," he agreed. She picked up the second letter from the table, the one addressed to Callum, and held it for a moment. Then she set it down. "When can we leave?" "Within the hour, if you're ready." "I've been ready since last night." He stood. He was very tall in the low-ceilinged room, and the morning light from the window caught the planes of his face, the pale blue of his eyes, the faint scar along his left cheekbone that she had not noticed until now. She found herself noticing it, and then making herself stop noticing it, which was its own kind of information. He crossed to the door and paused. "Lucy." It was the first time he had used her name. She had not given it to him. He had known it, which of course he had, but hearing it in his mouth was different from knowing he knew it. It landed differently. She looked at him. "What they did to your brother, and to you, will be answered. Not as a favor. As a matter of law and record." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that before we ride." She held his gaze back. This man who spoke precisely and kept his promises compressed into single sentences and occupied space without demanding anything from it. "I'll hold you to that," she said. "I expect you will." He went out. She stood in the pine-smelling room with her cloak and her satchel, and the 2 letters and her father's ring pressing into her palm, and she breathed in slowly, breathed out, and followed. The ride to Morvain took 2 days. Leander's escort was 6 riders, silent, disciplined, wearing the dark iron insignia of the Iron Vale seat on their chest straps. They moved fast and said little, which suited Lucy perfectly. She rode beside Soren for most of the first day, her gray cloak pulled against the cold, watching the landscape shift from the dense pine corridors of the ridge to the more open terrain of the northern borderlands, rolling frost-pale hills, bare-limbed ash trees, stone walls marking old field boundaries that no one had farmed in years. The Morvain territory began where the hills flattened and the sky opened, and she felt it before she could see the estate. Something in her chest that she had no proper name for, a recognition that was not the wolf sense she had never possessed, but something older and quieter. The knowledge of home. She had not been back in 14 months. She had left the day after her father's funeral, when Crest Ashvale had arrived with his condolences and his son, and a very practical conversation about the complications of an unmated Omega holding contested land alone. She had been 22 and grieving and surrounded by men who spoke about her future with the tone of people solving a logistics problem, and she had said yes to things she should have said let me think to, and she had left her own home and gone to theirs and spent a year making herself smaller in rooms that did not belong to her. She would not make herself smaller again. The Morvain estate came into view on the afternoon of the second day. A long stone house set into a hillside, 2 wings extending from a central hall, the windows catching the flat winter light. The grounds were quieter than she remembered. The staff had thinned, but smoke rose from the main chimney, and the gate stood intact. And when the riders came up the approach road, a figure appeared on the front steps. An old man, white-haired, wrapped in a heavy brown coat, leaning on a walking stick, and shading his eyes against the pale sky. Aldrich Morvain. He had received Soren's letter then. He had come. Lucy dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, which she knew was undignified, and did not care about. She crossed the distance between them, and the old man opened his arms, and she walked into them, and he held her with the particular grip of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is only now allowing themselves to stop. "Child," he said against her hair, "when they said you had gone." "I'm here," she said. "I'm here now." He pulled back and looked at her face, at the cloak, the satchel, the wrapped hands, and his expression moved through several things quickly before settling into something hard and clear. He looked past her at the Iron Veil riders, at Leander dismounting at the edge of the path, and whatever he saw in the Alpha King's bearing confirmed something for him, because he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has been waiting to act and has finally been given ground to act on. "Come inside," he said. "All of you. There is a great deal to discuss." The main hall smelled of old stone and wood smoke, and the particular mustiness of a house that had been running below its proper capacity. Not neglected, but reduced, the way a fire burns lower when there is less wood. Lucy moved through it slowly, touching things as she passed. The carved oak banister. The iron hook by the door where her father's hunting coat had always hung. Empty now, but the hook still there. The portrait at the top of the first landing. Her father's face looking back at her with the calm confidence of a man who had not known he was about to die. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went downstairs to the table. Aldrich had laid out what he knew, and it was more than she had expected. He had, it turned out, been watching the Ashvale arrangement with the wariness of someone who had known Crest Ashvale for 30 years and trusted him for none of them. He had copies of correspondence. He had the original deed of inheritance, witnessed and sealed in triplicate, stored in a locked chest in the estate's record room. He had the names of 2 council elders who had expressed private reservations about the Ashvale petition and might be persuaded to act on them. And he knew about Callum. "I've known for 2 months," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had been carrying something heavy alone. "I didn't know how to reach you without alerting the Ashvales. I tried twice through intermediaries. Both attempts were intercepted." He looked at his hands. "I should have tried harder." "You're trying now," Lucy said. "That's what matters." Leander had taken a seat at the far end of the table, present, attentive, but contained, leaving the conversation's center to Lucy and Aldrich. She noticed this. He did not insert himself or redirect the discussion toward political strategy, even though political strategy was clearly what his mind was working on. He waited, and when Aldrich finally looked at him directly and said, "And what is the Alpha King's position in all of this?" Leander answered without preamble, "I am here as an escort and a witness. What happens next is Lucy's decision." Aldrich studied him for a long moment, then looked at Lucy. She said, "We take the inheritance claim to the full council, not a petition, a presentation of record. The contract was unsigned at the point of bond registration because the ceremony never completed. The original deed supersedes. We present Aldrich as witness, produce the documentation, and challenge the Ashvale petition directly." She paused. "And then we move on, Callum." "The council session isn't for 3 weeks, Aldrich said. "I know. We use the 3 weeks." She looked at Leander. He looked back at her. "The Drenvar holding is 4 days west. I can have men at its boundary within 6 days if I send word tonight." "Not yet," she said. "If we move on the holding before the council session, Crest Ashvale will know we're operating, and he'll spend those 3 weeks poisoning the neutral seats. We wait until the session is 1 day away. We present the claim, and then the Drenvar coalition loses their political cover the moment the claim is registered," Leander said quietly, and she heard in his voice the thing she had begun to recognize as his version of approval. Not praise, just alignment. The sound of a mind meeting another mind at the same point, by different paths. "Exactly," she said. Aldrich looked between them, said nothing for a moment. Then, in the careful voice of an old man who has watched many things and has learned not to say everything he thinks, "Your father would have liked this," he said to Lucy. To Leander he said nothing, but the look he gave him was the look of a man doing a cautious reassessment. The 3 weeks were not quiet. On the 4th day, 2 Ashvale riders appeared at the Morvain gate under a banner of inquiry. Not aggression, technically, but the kind of inquiry that carries the shape of a threat. Lucy met them at the gate herself, standing in the cold with her hands clasped and her spine straight, and told them in a level voice that the Morvain estate was operating under full territorial autonomy and that any further inquiries regarding the status of its lady should be directed to the council registry. One of the riders opened his mouth to push further. He stopped when he noticed the 2 Iron Veil guards flanking the gate with the particular stillness of men who have not been told to act, but who are fully prepared to. The riders left. That night, Lucy sat by the fire in the library, her father's library, the shelves still full of his books, the smell of old leather and dried ink everywhere. And Leander came to the doorway and stood there without coming in, which she had noticed he did. He occupied thresholds. He did not enter her spaces without being invited. "They'll report back," she said without looking up from the document she was reading. "Crest Ashvale will know I'm here." "Yes." "Good. Let him know. Let him understand I'm not hiding." A pause. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm afraid of many things," she said honestly. "I'm afraid of being managed again. I'm afraid of my brother being hurt before we can reach him. I'm afraid—" She stopped, looked up. "I'm afraid of being the kind of person who signs things without reading them, because she believes what she wants to believe." He came to the doorway edge, but no further. "That's not stupidity. That's what happens when someone spends significant effort making you feel safe. Don't excuse it. I'm not excusing it. I'm identifying what was done to you." His voice was quiet. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight made the room warm and amber, and his face at the threshold was half in light and half in shadow, and she was aware, with sudden and uncomfortable sharpness, of how much space he had come to occupy in her thinking over these 3 weeks. Not in a comfortable way. in the way that a stone in a boot occupies space. Specifically, constantly, impossible to ignore. She looked back at her document. You should rest. So should you. I will when I've finished this. He didn't move for a moment. Then, Lucy. She waited. Callum is going to be all right. She pressed her lips together, did not trust herself to respond immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But I will make it true if it is within my power, and most things are within my power. It was an extraordinary thing to say. It should have sounded arrogant. It did not. It sounded like what it was. A man telling her the precise and honest extent of his capability and offering it without condition or performance. She set down the document. Why? She said. The same question she had asked in the forest. The one he had not fully answered. This time the pause was longer. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same as always. Measured. Unhurried. But something underneath it had shifted. Something she felt more than heard. Because you wrapped your own hands, he said. In the dark, in the cold, after everything. You didn't ask for help. You just did what needed doing. Another pause. I've met very few people who do that. The fire snapped softly. Lucy looked at the threshold where he stood. This man who held 6 council seats and commanded 7 packs, and had appeared in a dark forest at the exact moment she had needed someone to appear, and she felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 3 weeks move in her chest like a tide coming in. Slow, inevitable, too large to stop once it had begun. She said nothing. She looked back at her document, but she did not tell him to leave, and he stayed at the threshold a little while longer in silence, before finally going. The council session was held in the great chamber of the Ashford Assembly Hall, 3 days' ride from Morvain, in a city that smelled of coal smoke and river water, and the particular tension of a place where too many powerful people had gathered in too small a space. Lucy arrived with Aldrich on her right, Leander 3 steps behind, and Soren at the rear with 2 Iron Veil guards in full insignia. She wore her father's colors, deep burgundy and gray, a fitted wool riding coat that Aldrich's housekeeper had found in a trunk and altered overnight. And she wore the Morvain signet ring on her right hand where everyone could see it. She had braided her hair back severely, and she walked the length of the assembly corridor without looking at anyone who was not looking directly at her, which meant she did not look at Dorian Ashvale, standing near the east entrance with his father and 3 advisors, until she had already taken her seat. When she did look at him, she made it brief and entirely without feeling. He looked shaken. She had not expected that. She had expected cold calculation, the face of a man adjusting his position. Instead, she saw something that might have been shame, or might have been the particular discomfort of someone who had convinced himself a wrong thing was acceptable, and is now being required to stand in front of it. She found she had nothing for that. No anger left for him specifically. The anger had moved past him and settled somewhere larger, somewhere structural, aimed at the system that had made his choices feel easy. Crest Ashvale, beside his son, looked at her with the flat assessment of a man recalculating odds. He looked past her at Leander. Something moved across his face. Not fear, but the shadow of it. Good, Lucy thought. Let him calculate. The session opened with procedural formalities that took the better part of an hour. Lucy sat through them with her hands flat on the table and her breathing even, listening to the shape of the room. Which elders spoke quickly and which chose their words. Which ones glanced at Crest Ashvale before speaking, and which did not. Which ones had the particular careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way the weight fell before committing. When the Morvain matter was called, Crest Ashvale moved first. He was practiced. She would give him that. He presented the marriage contract with the confidence of a man who had written the terms himself and knew every word. Laid out the signing, the intentions, argued that the flight of the contracted party constituted breach, and that the spirit of the transfer had been established regardless of the ceremony's completion. 3 elder seats nodded along. 2 remained still. One, Leander's senior delegate, a gray-haired woman named Petra, who had the eyes of someone who had heard every argument twice, watched Crest Ashvale the way a hawk watches something moving in grass. When he finished, Lucy stood. She did not ask permission. She stood, and the room adjusted to her, and she placed the original deed of inheritance on the table and spoke. She had rehearsed this. She had sat in her father's library for 3 weeks with documents and ink and Aldrich's patient corrections, and she knew every clause and every precedent and every point of law, and she presented them without rushing, without performing, without raising her voice once. The contract was contingent on bond registration. No bond had been registered. The original deed, witnessed in triplicate and held in unbroken custody at the Morvain Record House for 14 months, named her as sole heir. The Ashvale petition had no legal standing. Then she said, "I would also like to enter into record the matter of Callum Morvain, currently held in a Drenvar coalition holding as collateral against a debt incurred by Crest Ashvale. This arrangement was concealed from me during the contract negotiation and constitutes coercion under Council Statute 14, Section 3. The room went very still. Crest Ashvale's voice came hard and fast. "That is an unsubstantiated—" "I have a letter," said Petra, the gray-haired delegate, in a voice that cut across his like a blade through linen. She produced a folded document from her own case. "Received 4 days ago from the Drenvar Holdings' own record keeper, who is currently seeking council protection in exchange for testimony." She looked at Crest Ashvale without expression. It appears someone anticipated this session. Lucy did not look at Leander. She did not need to. She felt the fact of him behind her. Steady, present, having done in silence what he had said he would do. And she let that fact be what it was, without naming it aloud. The vote took less than an hour. The inheritance claim was upheld, 7 seats to 2. The Ashvale petition was dismissed. An immediate inquiry was opened into the coercion allegation. And before the session formally closed, Petra's delegate produced a second document, a writ of release for Callum Morvain, executable on Ironvale authority given the Drenvar coalition's now exposed position, and placed it in front of Leander for countersignature. He signed it without ceremony, without looking at Lucy, without doing anything that could be described as performance. She watched his hand on the page and felt the tight, terrible knot that had lived behind her sternum for 8 months, the knot that had the shape of her brother's name. Finally, quietly, release. Dorian found her in the corridor afterward. She heard him coming and did not stop walking, which forced him to catch up, which she suspected was not the dynamic he had intended. "Lucy, Dorian. I want you to know—" He stopped. Started again. "I did not know about Callum. What my father arranged. I was not aware of the extent." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. This handsome, careful man who had brought her bread every morning and watched her sign a contract and said she trusts you in a voice that contained neither pride nor guilt, and she felt, with absolute clarity, that she believed him about Callum. She also felt, with equal clarity, that it did not matter. "You knew about the inheritance clauses," she said. He was quiet. "You knew what you were marrying me for." Still quiet. "I don't hate you, Dorian," she said. And it was true, and the truth of it was somehow more final than hatred would have been. "I just don't have anything left to say to you." She walked away. He did not follow. Callum came home 11 days later. He rode in through the Morvain gate on a borrowed horse, thinner than she remembered, with a beard he hadn't had before, and a quietness in his eyes that would take time to understand. But he rode upright. And when he saw her standing in the courtyard, he dismounted in one motion, and crossed the distance between them, and held her the way siblings hold each other after they have been separately afraid for a long time, fiercely, without elegance, without any need to explain. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. "You got my letter," he said. "Eventually. I'm sorry I couldn't answer sooner." "Stop," she said. "You're here." He pulled back and looked at her face, the way Aldrich had, reading the changes, cataloging the months. Then he looked past her at Leander, who stood near the stable door at a respectful distance, talking quietly with Soren. "That's him," Callum said. Not a question. "Yes." "He's the one who—" "Yes." Her brother was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said finally, simply, and she understood that he meant it in the largest possible sense. That evening, after dinner, after Callum had been shown to a room and Aldrich had finally gone to bed and the house had settled into its new, fuller quiet, Lucy found Leander in the library. He was standing at the window, looking out at the dark grounds, the way he stood at thresholds, present but not demanding, occupying space without filling it more than it needed to be filled. She came and stood beside him, and for a while they both looked out at the frost-pale garden and the bare ash trees and the moonlight on the stone wall. "You arranged the record keeper," she said, 3 weeks ago. "You didn't tell me. You had enough to carry." She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her. Had been, she suspected, for longer than the moment she turned. In the firelight, his eyes were less pale than usual, warmer, and the scar along his cheekbone caught the light the way familiar things do when you have finally stopped pretending not to notice them. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on you." "Does it?" "Yes." He turned to face her fully, and his voice was the same as always, low, even, carrying that quality of absolute steadiness. But something in it was more open than she had heard it before. Not vulnerable exactly. Honest. "I am not going to tell you what I feel, and then require you to feel the same. That is not how this works. Not with me." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the forest, and the linen, and the broth, and the threshold he always stopped at. She thought about the writ of release signed without ceremony. She thought about 3 weeks of a man who never once made her feel managed. "I know what you feel," she said quietly. "I know you do," he said. "You've known for a while." "I was afraid of it." "I know that too." She exhaled slowly. "I don't want to be protected," she said. "I want to stand beside someone. I want to be part of the plan, not the reason for it." "You have been part of every plan since the forest," he said. "I would not have it any other way." The fire breathed softly behind them. Outside, the wind moved through the ash trees, and the moon was high and full and indifferent. The same moon that had lit the pine forest 11 weeks ago when she had climbed out of a window with a bone-handled knife and thorns on her hands and nowhere to go. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically. Just took it, the way you take something you have been standing next to long enough to stop pretending you don't want. His hand closed around hers, steady and warm. "I'm still difficult," she said. "I'm counting on it." Crest Ashvile faced the council inquiry in the early spring. The testimony of the Drenvar record keeper was thorough and damning, and 3 other voices came forward once the first one had spoken. The way truth tends to accumulate once someone gives it room. He was stripped of 2 allied pack territories and removed from his council seat. His son Dorian left the Ashvale estate that same month, quietly, without contest, and took a minor administrative post in the south. No one heard much from him after that. Aldrich Morvain returned to his proper role as territorial elder, this time with full council recognition and a seat at the regional assembly. He was, by all accounts, excellent at it. Callum Morvain spent the first months after his return very quietly, relearning the weight of ordinary days. He rode the territory with Lucy, learned which fences needed mending, sat with Aldrich over ledgers and maps. Slowly, the quietness in his eyes became less like damage and more like depth. He never spoke much about the 8 months in the Drenvar holding. Lucy did not ask him to. In the summer, Lucy Morvain and Leander Voss stood before the council in the Ashford Assembly Hall, the same hall where the session had been held, the same room where she had stood with documents and a signet ring and spoken without raising her voice. And they registered their bond. Not because it was required, not because it was strategic, because she had chosen it in full knowledge of what she was choosing, and she wanted the record to reflect that. Petra, the gray-haired delegate, signed as witness. Leander, for the first time in any official proceeding that anyone present could recall, smiled. It was brief. It was real. She had climbed out of a window once, in a gray cloak, with thorns on her hands and no plan except away. She had believed in slow-growing things in poor soil and had called that patience when it was really fear, and she had signed her name to things she should have read because it was easier than admitting she was surrounded by people who did not love her. She did not regret the thorns. She did not regret the dark forest or the cold or the fear or any of the difficult months between. Without them, she would not have known what solid ground felt like when she finally stood on it. She stood on it now, beside the man who had never once asked her to be smaller, in the house her father had built, with her brother in the next room, and the Morvain seal on her hand, and the full weight of a life that was entirely, irrevocably her own. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.